I won $3.2 million in a scratch-off lottery ticket I bought on a Tuesday afternoon while waiting for my car to finish at the oil change place. I remember standing under the flickering fluorescent light in that gas station, using a dime I found in my jacket pocket to scratch the silver coating off, and just staring at the numbers for so long that the cashier asked if I was okay. I was not okay. I was the most okay I had ever been in my entire life. And I had absolutely no idea what to do about it. My name is Phoebe. I'm 31 years old. At the time of that scratch-off, I was a medical billing specialist working out of a converted spare bedroom in my apartment, making just enough to cover rent and groceries if I was careful about both. I had one maxed-out credit card, a car with a cracked windshield I kept meaning to fix, and a family that had spent the better part of a decade treating me like a charity case they were tired of funding, except they had never actually funded anything. Before I touched a single dollar of that money, I needed to know the truth about the people closest to me. I had spent years wondering. Years making excuses. Years telling myself that my mother-in-law didn't actually mean it the way it sounded, that my husband's sister was just going through something, that maybe I was too sensitive. I was 31 years old and I was still negotiating with my own instincts, so I ran a test. I called my mother-in-law on a Thursday evening and told her my landlord had served me an eviction notice. I said I had 72 hours to come up with $800, or I'd be out on the street. My voice was steady. I had practiced it. I said I was scared and I didn't know who else to call. She let me finish. Then she said, "Phoebe, honey, you know we'd love to help, but we're really stretched thin right now with the renovations." The renovations she was referring to were the ones on the lake house, the second property they owned outright. She told me to call 211, which is a social services hotline. She told me they had resources for situations like mine. Then she said she had to go because her show was starting. I called my husband's brother next, my brother-in-law, who had borrowed $3,000 from me 18 months earlier and had not mentioned it once since. I told him the same story. He didn't even let me finish. He said he was between paychecks and that I should have been saving better, and that honestly, with what I made working from home, I needed to be thinking about getting a real office job with benefits. He'd said some version of that to me at every family gathering for 4 years. I sat with the phone in my lap for a while after that. Then I called my husband's sister. She and I weren't particularly close. We texted occasionally, mostly about her dog and a cooking show we both watched. She lived about 40 minutes away with her 2 kids and worked as a teacher's aide at an elementary school. Her husband had left 8 months earlier, and the divorce wasn't final yet. She was doing everything on one income, and I knew it. I told her what I'd told the others. Eviction notice, $800. 72 hours. She was quiet for a second, then she said, "Okay, let me figure something out. Don't panic. Can I call you back in 10 minutes? She called back in 9. She said she could do $400 right now from her savings, which she told me was basically all of it, and that she was going to ask her neighbor to watch the kids Saturday morning so she could drive over and bring it in cash because she didn't want to do a wire transfer and have it take too long. She asked if I'd eaten dinner. I said yes. She said okay, and that she'd see me Saturday and to call her if anything changed. I told her not to come. I said I'd sorted it out. She said she was relieved and then asked if I was sure, twice, before she believed me. I cried in my car for 20 minutes after I hung up. The test was over. I knew everything I needed to know. Here is what I knew about my husband's family by then, though I hadn't yet put it together the way I eventually would. My mother-in-law ran the family like a corporation, where she was the only voting shareholder. Every holiday, every decision, every occasion was filtered through her approval. She had a particular talent for making you feel like her generosity was the only thing standing between you and ruin, even when she had never given you anything. My husband, we had been together for 6 years, married for 2, had spent his whole life trying to earn a grade she never actually gave out. He was the younger of 2 kids, and his older brother was the one who got the visible approval, the business introductions, the offhand comments about potential and ambition. My husband got comments about stability and practicality. He got told his ideas were too risky. When he started his own small landscaping company 4 years ago, his mother had called it a nice hobby. The company was doing fine, for the record. Better than fine. He had 6 full-time employees and a waiting list. His brother worked in commercial real estate and wore it like a uniform. He talked about deals the way some people talk about sports scores, constantly to anyone with a sense that everyone should be impressed and also slightly envious. He had the same talent as his mother for making you feel subtly dismissed without ever saying anything you could specifically object to. When he borrowed that $3,000 from me, he'd made it sound like he was doing me a favor by letting me contribute to something important. His sister was different. She'd always been a little quieter at family gatherings, a little more likely to end up in the kitchen helping with dishes than performing in the living room. After her husband left, she'd been even more subdued. I'd noticed her mother-in-law, her own mother, had barely mentioned the separation except to say once, in front of everyone, that these things happened and that she hoped the children wouldn't be affected. That was the whole conversation. She had $400 in her savings, and she offered me all of it without hesitating. I claimed the lottery ticket through a trust. I hired an attorney in the city who specialized in asset protection, and I did not tell my husband. That is the part of this story that people sometimes push back on, and I understand why, but let me explain. My husband is not a bad person. He's actually a good person in a lot of ways, but he had been shaped by that family in ways he was still untangling, and I had watched him defer to his mother's judgment on things that had nothing to do with her for years. When we bought our apartment, she had opinions about the neighborhood. When I started working from home, she had opinions about that too, conveyed through him, softly, as concerns. I loved my husband, but I also knew that if I told him about the money before I had a clear picture of how his family would respond to it, I would lose the only window I'd ever have to see clearly. So I waited. I hired the attorney. I set up a trust under a name that meant nothing, a clean, generic LLC that could have belonged to anyone. I did not claim the ticket in my name. I let the 30 days run while I watched. And what I watched, during those 30 days, told me everything. My mother-in-law owned a commercial property on the edge of town. She'd inherited it from her own parents, and it had been generating rental income for over 20 years. She'd always been vague about it when it came up. It was just a building, she said, nothing interesting. Old tenants, the usual headaches. We knew it existed the way you know about a distant relative you've never met. My attorney found out, in the course of pulling together the financial picture I'd asked him to research, that the building was sitting on land that a regional grocery chain had been trying to acquire for 3 years. The chain wanted to demolish the existing structure and build a mid-sized store. The location was ideal, just off a main road, close to 2 residential developments that had gone up in the last 5 years. My mother-in-law's building was the last holdout in a block the grocery chain had otherwise already purchased. They had offered her $1.4 million for it, twice. She had told no one. I found out something else too. My brother-in-law, who worked in commercial real estate, had been brokering the deal on the grocery chain's behalf. He was the one who had facilitated the original offer. He had also, according to the paperwork my attorney tracked down, offered his mother a private arrangement. He would negotiate the sale through his firm. She would accept a slightly below-market offer, and he would personally pocket a brokerage fee that was, in my attorney's words, not something you'd set up unless you were trying to extract value before the other party understood what they actually had. He was quietly maneuvering to sell his mother's property at a price she didn't know was low, collect the commission, and leave her thinking she'd done well. He had borrowed $3,000 from me. 41 days after I bought that scratch-off ticket, my mother-in-law called a family dinner. She announced at the table, over a pot roast she'd made and which she would later mention twice, that she had been approached by a commercial buyer for the building and was thinking it might be time to sell. My brother-in-law immediately said he thought it was a great idea and that he'd been researching buyers and thought he had a strong lead. He smiled the way he smiled when he thought he was being subtle. My mother-in-law looked at my husband and said that of course when the sale finalized, there would be money coming to the family, and she wanted to be thoughtful about how that was distributed. She looked at my husband when she said this in a way that meant she was not primarily thinking about my husband. Then she looked at me and said she had always believed that family money should stay in the family, which was something she said the way people say things that are technically statements but are actually policies. I smiled. I said that made complete sense. After dinner, my husband's sister and I ended up in the kitchen. She was washing a serving dish. I was drying. Her kids had stayed home with a sitter. She looked tired in the specific way she'd looked tired since the separation. Not sleepy but worn, like something that had been used more than it was built for. She asked how I was doing. Not the dinner table version, the real version. I told her I'd been stressed about money. It wasn't entirely a lie. Managing a $3.2 million trust while pretending nothing had changed was genuinely stressful. She said she understood. She said she'd been having a hard time too, that the divorce was costing more than she'd expected, and that she was behind on the kids' dental appointments because she was trying to decide between that and a car repair she'd been deferring for 2 months. She said it the way people say things they're embarrassed to say, quickly, while looking at the dish instead of at me. I said I was sorry. She said she was fine. We finished the dishes. The confrontation, I'm going to call it that because that's what it was, happened 6 weeks later, at my mother-in-law's house on a Sunday afternoon she had framed as a casual get-together. It was not casual. She had asked my husband to come by early, without me, to talk about the building sale. He'd told me about it afterward. Which meant she hadn't told him not to, which meant she hadn't thought it mattered whether I knew. He said she'd talked about the structure of the sale and mentioned that his brother was handling the transaction and that she was planning to distribute the proceeds in a way that made sense given everyone's circumstances. When I arrived that afternoon, my brother-in-law was already there with his wife. My husband's sister came a little later, alone. Her kids were with a neighbor. My mother-in-law had made coffee. She had also, I noticed, placed a folder on the side table near her chair. She got to it about 40 minutes in. She said she'd been thinking hard about how to handle the sale of the building. She said she wanted to be fair but also practical. She opened the folder and took out a single page and placed it on the coffee table. It was a document transferring a portion of the expected sale proceeds to my brother-in-law's firm as a consulting fee. The consulting fee was $380,000. My mother-in-law explained that she felt it was appropriate to compensate him for the work he'd done in identifying the buyer and managing the transaction. She said she hoped everyone understood and that the remainder would be distributed thoughtfully. My husband's sister looked at the paper. She didn't say anything. She had the expression of someone who has learned that the right response to unfair things in this family is no visible response at all. I looked at the document. Then I looked at my brother-in-law, who was nodding in that way he had, measured and self-satisfied, as if he were being gracious by accepting. I asked, very calmly, what the total sale amount was. My mother-in-law said that was still being finalized. I said I had heard it was around 1.4 million and I was curious what percentage 380,000 represented. The room got quiet in the specific way rooms get quiet when someone has said the thing that wasn't supposed to be said out loud. My brother-in-law said the sale was actually expected to come in closer to 1.1 million. I said that was interesting because the county property records I'd reviewed, available to anyone with a computer, showed 2 offers from the acquiring company over the past 3 years, both at 1.4 million. I said I was curious why the current figure was lower. He said property values fluctuated and that he was the professional in the room. I agreed that he was. I said that was exactly why I'd had my own attorney review the transaction. My mother-in-law set down her coffee cup. I put a folder on the table. It had the comparison I'd asked my attorney to prepare. The 2 previous offers, the current proposed sale price, the market analysis, and a highlighted section showing the brokerage fee structure my brother-in-law had quietly arranged for himself. I said to my mother-in-law that her building was worth 1.4 million. That the buyer had already confirmed they were willing to pay that the offer being presented to her was $300,000 less than what she was owed, and that the person negotiating on her behalf had a direct financial incentive to keep the price low. She looked at the folder. She looked at her older son. He said I was misreading the documents. I said I had a real estate attorney who would be happy to explain them to her directly. My mother-in-law picked up the paper with the consulting fee and held it for a moment. I watched her process something she clearly did not want to process in front of people. Then she set it face down on the table. What happened in the room after that took about another 40 minutes. My brother-in-law tried 3 different framings. First he said I was confused. Then he said this was standard industry practice. Then he said that as the person who had actually done the work, he deserved to be compensated and that nobody in this family had ever appreciated what he contributed. My mother-in-law did not say anything during this. She looked at the table. My husband, to his credit, sat quietly and let me talk. Afterward, in the car, he said he'd had a feeling about the building for years, but hadn't been able to name it. He said he was sorry it had taken me showing him a folder of evidence to make it concrete. My husband's sister left before the end. She slipped out while her brother was on his third framing. I found out later she had driven home, put her kids to bed, and then sat in her car in the driveway for a while. She texted me that night. Just, "Are you okay?" I said yes. I said we should talk soon. The building sold for $1.4 million. My mother-in-law negotiated directly with the buyer, with a different attorney, one I had recommended, and my brother-in-law was not involved in the transaction. His consulting fee was not paid. He did not speak to me for 4 months. He called my husband twice to say I had overstepped and embarrassed the family. My husband told him he disagreed and that the conversation was over. My mother-in-law did not thank me. She didn't need to. She was a woman who had spent 60 years protecting her own interests and was not accustomed to needing help with that. But at Christmas, she put food on my plate without being asked, which for her was something. I told my husband about the lottery money 2 weeks after the building situation resolved. I sat him down at the kitchen table on a Saturday morning and I told him everything: the ticket, the trust, the attorney, the test, the whole sequence. I told him why I'd waited. I told him I understood if he was angry. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "The eviction thing. You called my sister." I said yes. He said, "She would have given you everything she had." I said I knew. I said that was why I needed her to be the first person I took care of. He cried a little, which he does not often do, and then he asked what we were going to do next. What we did next started with his sister. I asked her to meet me for coffee on a Tuesday morning. We went to a place near her apartment, not fancy. The kind of place with mismatched chairs and a chalkboard menu. She got there first and had already ordered, which was something she always did. Arriving early, preparing, not wanting to put anyone out. I sat down and put an envelope on the table between us. She looked at it. She looked at me. She said, "Phoebe, what is this?" I told her to open it. Inside was a single piece of paper. It was a printout from the bank. A new savings account opened in her name. The opening balance was $200,000. She stared at it for a long time. Long enough that the person at the counter called out a coffee order and neither of us moved. Then she looked up and she said, "I don't understand." I told her about the ticket, the real version, start to finish. I told her about the test. I told her what her mother had said, what her brother had said, and what she had said. I told her that she had been the only one who tried to help me and that she had offered to drain her savings account, which had $400 in it, to make sure I was okay. I said, "You were trying to help me when you could barely help yourself. That's not something I'm going to forget." She shook her head. She said it wasn't the same, that anyone would have done that. I said that was demonstrably not true. I had called 3 people and she was the only one who picked up. She cried. Not gently. The kind of crying that happens when something has been held in for a long time and finally gets released all at once. She pressed both hands over her face and her shoulders shook, and I sat there and didn't try to make it stop. When she came back up, she said, "I've been so scared, I didn't want anyone to know how scared I was." I said I knew. I said she didn't have to be scared anymore. I slid the envelope a little closer. The $200,000 was a start. Over the following weeks, I also paid off the outstanding legal fees from her divorce, covered 6 months of her kids' after-school program so she didn't have to choose between working late and pickup time, and had her car repaired, not just the immediate problem but a full going over, everything that needed doing so she wouldn't have to think about it. She tried to push back on each thing. I had a standard response, which was, "You drove to a hospital at midnight in a rainstorm with your last $400 for someone who wasn't even sick. This is not a debt you owe me. This is a debt I owe you." She stopped pushing back around the 3rd time. "I'm going to tell you what happened to everyone else, because people always want to know." My brother-in-law lost the biggest transaction of his career when the building sale went to a different firm. He had also, it turned out, been operating slightly outside the edges of his license on several other deals, And the same attorney who caught his arrangement with my mother-in-law found enough to file a complaint with the state licensing board. He is still licensed, but under a compliance review. His wife is still with him. I don't know what she knows. The $3,000 he borrowed from me was returned 4 months after the confrontation via a check sent to my husband with no note attached. My mother-in-law is the more complicated one. She is not a villain in a simple way. She is a woman who grew up learning that security came from controlling the resources around her, and that family was a structure rather than a feeling. She's not warm, but I have started to think she might be capable of more than I gave her credit for. She called my husband's sister on her birthday this year, actually called, not just texted, and when she mentioned to me once, offhand, that she'd seen the kids' drawings on her refrigerator, I noticed she sounded something close to pleased. She has not apologized for anything specific. I don't expect her to. But she has, in the quiet language she operates in, begun to treat me like someone who belongs. My husband and I are okay. We are more than okay. We have bought a house, not a big or showy one, the right size for us. And he has expanded the landscaping company to a second city. He makes his own decisions now with a steadiness he didn't quite have before, like a person who has stopped waiting for a grade that was never going to come. And his sister is doing well. She got the divorce finalized. She kept her job at the school and also started taking evening courses. Her kids are healthy. Her car runs. She doesn't worry about the dental appointments anymore. She called me a few weeks ago, a Friday afternoon, just to talk. We ended up on the phone for an hour and a half about nothing important, the cooking show, something funny her older kid had said, a book I'd recommended she hadn't started yet. Normal things. The kind of call you make to someone who is actually your family. At the end of it she said, "You know you're my favorite person, right?" I said she was mine too. I meant it in a way that didn't need any explanation. She was the person who showed up in a rainstorm with her last $400 because she couldn't stand the thought of me being alone in a waiting room. That is not a small thing. That is the whole thing. You find out who people are when you have nothing to offer them. Some people show you something you can't unsee, and some people, the ones worth keeping, show you exactly who they've been all along. Before I go, I want to ask you something. Have you ever reached out to someone in your family for help and been turned away, and then had a stranger or someone you barely knew step in instead? Tell me about it in the comments. I read every single one. If this story meant something to you, hit like and subscribe. We put out news stories every week on this channel, and every single one of them is about exactly this: finding the people who actually show up. I used to think that the hardest thing about having nothing was the fear. The fear of a bill you can't cover, a car that won't start, a month that's longer than your paycheck. But I was wrong. The hardest thing about having nothing is that it shows you exactly who sees you as a burden and who sees you as a person. My mother-in-law had a lake house. My brother-in-law had a lake house. My brother-in-law had a license and a salary and $3,000 of my money sitting in his account. And when I said I needed $800 or I'd be out on the street, they both found a reason it wasn't their problem. That's not cruelty for cruelty's sake. It's something quieter and more corrosive than that. It's the kind of thinking that only works when you believe the other person will just keep absorbing it. They had done the math on me, privately, and decided I was someone who could be counted on to need things and never be owed anything. My sister-in-law didn't do that math. She was raising 2 kids on one income with a divorce not yet finalized and $400 in her savings account, and when I called her she said give me 10 minutes and called back in 9 with a plan. That's not a small thing. That's a person who looked at the cost and decided you were worth it anyway. What I've come to understand, not as a philosophy, just as something I've watched play out in real life, is that people's choices accumulate. My brother-in-law didn't just make one bad decision when he quietly set up that consulting fee arrangement. He had been making smaller versions of that same decision for years. Take the angle, protect the advantage, let someone else absorb the loss. By the time I put the documents on that coffee table, his pattern was already fully formed. He had practiced it into something he didn't even notice anymore. And my sister-in-law had been making her version of that choice too. The opposite version. Showing up. Asking if you'd eaten. Calling back in 9 minutes. Those things also accumulate. They build a person who acts without calculating, because acting without calculating has become her default. I think about that a lot now. The way we practice, quietly and consistently, who we're becoming, not in grand moments, but in the small Tuesday afternoon ones, when nobody's watching and the stakes seem low enough to take the easy way out. I'm not the same person I was the morning I scratched that ticket under a flickering gas station light. I have more money and a house with good windows and a husband who makes his own decisions now. But the thing that actually changed me wasn't the money. It was seeing with total clarity what I had been working with and for years refusing to fully acknowledge. The money just turned the lights on. My sister-in-law is doing okay now. More than okay. She called me on a Friday just to talk, and we were on the phone for an hour and a half about nothing important, the way you are with someone who is actually your family. That call meant more to me than the scratch-off did. You can win money on a Tuesday. It takes much longer to find the people worth keeping. If you recognize yourself anywhere in this story, either version, I hope you're honest with yourself about which version it is. And I hope you know it's not too late to start building a different pattern. That's the part nobody tells you. Who you are isn't fixed. It's just practiced.